A dancer vanishes into darkness, leaving only questions behind. Welcome to Shadow Code. I am your host, Thornwick. Comment where you're watching. Your words make this journey unforgettable. The stage lights were off, but the fear in her voice still lit up the room. I should have paid more attention to that tremor when Vera Blackwood first walked into Nero Wolfe's office that Tuesday morning in October, but I was too busy noticing other things. The way she moved with the controlled grace of someone who had trained her body to be an instrument of expression. The defiant tilt of her chin that suggested she was used to fighting battles, and the fact that her hands, despite her obvious attempt at composure, wouldn't stop shaking. She was what you might call handsome rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Her black hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the elegant line of her neck, and she wore a simple grey wool dress that probably cost more than most people make in a month. But it was her voice that got to me, low, slightly husky, with an accent that suggested European training and American polish. The October morning had started like any other in the old brownstone on West 35th Street. I'd arrived at 9 to find Fritz Brenner already bustling around the kitchen, preparing Wolfe's breakfast tray with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. The orchids in the plant rooms were blooming magnificently, Theodore Horseman had reported, and Wolfe was in his usual expansive mood that comes from contemplating natural beauty and the prospect of fresh truffles. I was sorting through the morning. Mail, bills, advertisements for rare books, and a threatening letter from our accountant about quarterly tax payments, when the doorbell rang. Fritz emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, but I waved him away. Visitors before 10 in the morning were usually either desperate or bill collectors, and I was curious to see which category this one fell into. Through the one-way glass in the front door, I could see a woman in her mid-30s, well-dressed but clearly agitated. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected to be followed, and her posture had the coiled tension of a dancer, even when standing still. I opened the door and she looked up at me with eyes that were both determined and frightened. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," she said without preamble. "It's about a missing person and I think she may be in terrible danger." "Mr. Wolfe doesn't see anyone without an appointment," I told her, which was true but not inflexible. "However, if you'd like to tell me what this is about, I might be able to arrange something." "My name is Vera Blackwood. I'm the artistic director of the Meridian Theatre Company. One of our principal dancers, Margot Fenneman, disappeared 3 nights ago under circumstances that make no sense. The police won't help because they think she left voluntarily, but I know Margot. She would never abandon her responsibilities, especially not 2 days before opening night." There was something in her voice, a combination of professional frustration and personal fear, that made me step aside and invite her in. I led her to the front room to wait while I consulted with Wolfe, who was in the kitchen discussing the day's menu with Fritz. "A missing dancer," I told him. "The artistic director of some theatre company thinks something bad happened to her." Wolfe looked up from the market list he was reviewing. "Ballet?" She didn't say. "Modern dance, I think, based on the company name." Wolfe's interest in various forms of dance was academic rather than practical, but he had strong opinions. "About artistic integrity. Show her in and bring coffee." When I returned to the front room, Vera Blackwood was examining the orchid arrangements with the focused attention of someone trying to distract herself from worry. She followed me back to the office and settled into the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk with the kind of careful positioning that spoke of years of dance training. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I need your help. Someone has disappeared, and I'm afraid they may be dead. Nero Wolfe, all 1/6 of a ton of him, didn't even look up from the orchid catalogue he'd been studying when Fritz had shown her in. This was typical. When Wolfe is absorbed in something, Whether it's orchids, food, or a particularly challenging crossword puzzle, the rest of the world might as well not exist. I've seen him ignore phone calls from the police commissioner, dinner invitations, from wealthy dowagers, and once, memorably, a small fire in the kitchen wastebasket. "Archie," he said without lifting his eyes, "please inform Miss Blackwood that my fee for finding missing persons is $500 per day, plus expenses, with a minimum retainer of $1,500. I turned to our potential client, with what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "You heard the man. He's expensive but effective. The question is, who's missing, and why do you think they might be dead?" Vera Blackwood's composure cracked just a little, and I saw her swallow hard before answering. "Her name is Margot Fenneman. She was one of our principal dancers at the Meridian Theatre Company. She disappeared 3 days ago, right after our final rehearsal for Shadows and Light. We open tomorrow night, and Margot was supposed to dance the lead. She would never just walk away from a performance. Never." That got Wolfe's attention. He set down his catalogue and fixed her with the stare that had unnerved everyone from small-time crooks to cabinet members. "You said, was one of your dancers. Past tense. That suggests certainty about her fate. She stopped, collected herself, and started again. "I suppose I'm preparing for the worst. Margot was many things, but unreliable wasn't one of them. She's been dancing professionally for 15 years. She understands what it means to have responsibilities to the company, to the other dancers, to the audience. The only reason she wouldn't show up for a performance is if she couldn't show up, if she were injured or sick or dead," Wolfe finished for her. "Yes." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "I've often wondered if that chair was specially reinforced, or if it was simply held together by stubbornness and daily prayers. Tell me about Miss Fenneman. Age, background, personal relationships. Had she received any threats? Was she in debt? Did she have enemies?" "Margot is 32. She trained at the American Ballet Theatre School, though she moved into modern dance early in her career. She's danced with companies in Boston and Chicago before joining us at Meridian 2 years ago. She's incredibly talented, probably the best dancer we've ever had. As for personal relationships..." Vera hesitated, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "Margot keeps to herself mostly. She's friendly enough with the other dancers, but she doesn't socialize much outside of work. She lives alone in a studio apartment on the Upper West Side. No boyfriend that I know of, though there was some talk about her and one of our male dancers, David Kessler, but nothing came of it." "What sort of talk?" I asked. "The usual theatre. Gossip. David was interested, made no secret of it, but Margot wasn't. She turned him down gently but firmly. David took it well enough, or seemed to, but there was some awkwardness between them for a while." Wolfe grunted, which could mean anything. "From mild interest to severe indigestion. Threats," he prompted. "Not that she mentioned to me, but..." Another hesitation. "The dance world can be competitive, vicious even. There are always jealousies, rivalries. Margot was getting roles that other dancers wanted. That creates resentment." "Specify." "Well, Elena Rodriguez has been with the company longer than Margot, and she expected to get the lead in Shadows and Light. When I gave it to Margot instead, Elena was disappointed. And there's Boris Petrov, one of our male dancers. He's been lobbying for us to do more classical pieces because that's his strength, but Margot was better suited for the modern work we've been focusing on. Boris can be volatile when he feels his career isn't progressing as it should." I was taking notes, building a mental list of people to interview. "You spoke of a final rehearsal. Was anything unusual about Miss Fenneman's behavior that evening?" "Now that you mention it, yes. She seemed distracted during the first half of rehearsal, missed a few cues, which isn't like her. Margot is usually letter perfect by final rehearsal, But then, during our break, we always take a 20-minute break. Halfway through evening rehearsals, she got a phone call. When she came back, she was different, focused again, but also, I don't know how to describe it, like she had made some kind of decision. A decision about what? Wolfe asked. I don't know, but her whole demeanor changed. She danced the second. Half of rehearsal with an intensity I'd never seen from her before, almost like she was dancing for her life. What time did the rehearsal end? Around 10:30. Most of the dancers left right away. They had an early call the next morning for costume fittings, but I stayed behind to go over some notes with our choreographer, Marcus Webb. When I left at 11:15, Margot's car was still in the parking lot. Her car is still there. No, it was gone the next morning. That's part of what's so strange. If someone hurt her, why would they move her car? And if she left voluntarily, why didn't she tell anyone? Why didn't she call in sick or make some excuse? No, it was gone the next morning. That's part of what's so strange. If someone hurt her, why would they move her car? And if she left voluntarily, why didn't she tell anyone? Why didn't she call in sick or make some excuse? It was a good question, and I could see Wolfe filing it away in that remarkable brain of his. He asked for Margot's address and the details of her car, a blue Honda Civic, 3 years old, license plate number LKM 7834, and then surprised me by accepting the case. Usually he requires more convincing, more evidence that the matter is worthy of his attention, but something about Vera Blackwood's story had hooked him. Very well, he said. Archie will visit Miss Fenneman's apartment and speak with the other members of your company. I assume you have their addresses. Vera nodded and handed me a typed list that she pulled from her purse. I thought you might need these. She was prepared. I'd give her that. The list was organized and thorough, with not just names and addresses, but also phone numbers and brief notes about each person's role in the company. Besides Vera herself, who was listed as artistic director, there were 6 dancers: David Kessler, whom she'd mentioned, Elena Rodriguez, James Park, Natasha Williams, Boris Petrov, and someone called Tommy Fitzgerald. There was also Marcus Webb, the choreographer, Claire Vance, the stage manager, and Stephen Chen listed as a musician. One more question, Wolfe said as Vera stood to leave. Why come to me? Why not the police? I did go to the police. Yesterday morning, they took a report, but they said they couldn't do anything for at least 48 hours. Adults have the right to disappear if they want to, they told me. They said unless there was evidence of foul play, they would treat it as a voluntary missing person case. They don't understand that Margot wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't do that to us, to the company. She takes her commitment seriously. Or, I said, she wouldn't do it unless she had no choice. The fear was back in Vera's eyes, stronger now. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. As she was writing out a check for the retainer, I studied the list more carefully. The addresses were scattered throughout Manhattan, from the Upper East Side to the Village. I was calculating travel time when Vera handed me the check. There's one more thing, she said, hesitating at the door. Margot has been acting differently for the past few weeks, more nervous, more distracted. She kept looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was following her. When I asked her about it, she said it was nothing, just pre-performance jitters. But Margot doesn't get jitters. She's one of the most composed performers I've ever worked with. After she left, Wolfe rang for Fritz and ordered lunch, breast of guinea hen with truffles, which struck me as optimistic given our bank balance. While he was consulting with Fritz about the wine selection, I called the Meridian Theatre Company to set up appointments with the dancers and staff. The theatre was in Midtown, not far from Lincoln Center, in one of those converted warehouses that seems to specialize in struggling arts organizations and ambitious dreams. The woman who answered the phone sounded harried and more than a little frantic. Meridian Theatre. This is Claire. Claire Vance, this is Archie Goodwin. I'm a private investigator looking into Margot Fenneman's disappearance. Vera Blackwood hired me. I'd like to set up some interviews with the company members, if possible. Oh, thank God. Vera said she was hiring someone. We're all just sick about Margot. She's such a vital part of this company, and with opening night tomorrow, I don't know how we're going to manage without her. Can you come this afternoon? We have rehearsal at 2, but we could talk before then. Everyone's going to be here early anyway, trying to figure out how to restructure the performance. I told her I'd be there at 1 o'clock and hung up. Wolfe was still discussing the guinea hen preparation with Fritz, something about the proper temperature for the truffle sauce, so I decided to take a preliminary look at Margot's apartment building. Sometimes you can learn as much from observing a person's environment as you can from talking to their friends and colleagues. The address Vera had given me led to a pre-war building on West 84th Street, the kind of place that had probably been elegant once, but now survived on rent-controlled tenants and minimal maintenance. The facade was brick, darkened by decades of city soot, with fire escapes that looked like they hadn't been inspected since the Coolidge administration. The lobby was small and shabby, with worn carpet and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. The doorman, a thin man in his 60s with tired eyes and the pallor of someone who spent most of his time indoors, was reading a racing form behind a battered desk that had probably been there since the building opened. His uniform was clean but frayed at the cuffs, and he looked up at me with the weary expression of someone who had seen too much and been surprised by too little. "I'm looking for information about Margot Fenneman in 4B, I told him, showing him my license. "She's been missing for 3 days and I'm investigating her disappearance." He looked at my license carefully, then back at my face, as if trying to memorize both. "That's so. I was wondering why I hadn't seen her." "Nice lady, Miss Fenneman. Quiet. Always said hello when she came in and out, not like some of the tenants who act like you're invisible." "When did you last see her?" "Saturday night, late. Must have been near midnight when she came in. I was just about to go off duty. I worked the 4 to midnight shift most days. She looked, I don't know, upset maybe? Rushed. Usually she'd stop and chat for a minute, ask about my grandson or comment on the weather. But Saturday night she went straight to the elevator without her usual hello." "Did she seem frightened?" He considered this. "Not frightened exactly, but definitely not herself. She kept looking back at the door, like she thought someone might be following her. And she was carrying herself different, you know, more tense. Like she was ready to run or fight if she had to." "Did she come back down that night?" "Not that I saw, but I go off duty at midnight sharp. Jerry Kowalski takes over the night shift. He might have seen her if she left after I went home." I got Jerry Kowalski's name and his address. He lived in Queens and worked the midnight to 8 shift. Then I asked to see Margot's apartment. The doorman, whose name was Pete Garrison, was reluctant until I explained that Margot's employer had hired me to find her, and that her rent was probably going unpaid. "I suppose it would be all right," he said finally. "The building manager's been asking about her anyway. Rent was due Monday and she hasn't paid it. That's not like her either. Miss Fenneman always pays her rent on time, usually a few days. Early." He led me to the elevator, an ancient contraption that wheezed and groaned its way to the 4th floor. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of cooking odors and industrial disinfectant. Apartment 4B was at the end of the hall, with a solid wooden door that looked like it had been painted several times over the decades. Pete used his master key to open the door, and we stepped into a studio apartment that was small but immaculately organized. The Murphy bed was folded up into the wall, and the living area was arranged with the precision of someone who didn't have space for clutter. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, with a 2-burner stove and a refrigerator that looked like it had been manufactured during the Eisenhower years. But what struck me immediately was how neat everything was. The bed, when Pete pulled it down from the wall, was made with hospital corners. The few dishes in the sink were washed and stacked. There were no clothes thrown over chairs, no newspapers scattered around, no signs of the casual disorder that most people live with. It was the apartment of someone who valued control and organization, or perhaps someone who was always ready to leave at a moment's notice. The only personal touches were dance-related. Framed photographs of Margot in various costumes and poses lined the windowsill. A shelf of dance books occupied one wall, and a small collection of music boxes featuring tiny ballerinas was arranged on the dresser. The photographs showed her progression as a dancer. Early pictures where she looked young and eager, later ones where she appeared more confident and sophisticated. On the dresser, beside the music boxes, was a program from the Chicago Ballet, theater with Margot's name listed among the corps de ballet members. It was dated 3 years ago, and someone, presumably Margot, had drawn a small star next to her name. There were also programs from other companies in Boston and Philadelphia, creating a paper trail of her career. She kept to herself mostly, Pete said, watching me examine the room. Nice girl, but private. Didn't have many visitors, only regular. One I ever seen was another dancer. Came by maybe once a month. Tall guy with red hair and one of those dancer builds, you know? Red hair? Did you get his name? Never asked, but I heard her call him David once when they were talking in the lobby. He looked like a dancer, though. You know, the way they carry themselves, all straight and controlled. He was here Saturday night, too, matter of fact. Came in maybe an hour after Miss Fenneman did, around 1 in the morning. Looked upset about something. That was interesting and potentially important. David Kessler, the dancer who'd been romantically interested in Margot, had visited her apartment very late on the night she disappeared. I made a note to ask him about it when I got to the theater. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd about the bathroom. The medicine cabinet was open, and there was a small pile of white pills scattered on the floor by the toilet, as if someone had swept the contents of a prescription bottle into the bowl but missed a few. The bathroom was otherwise as neat as the rest of the apartment, which made the scattered pills stand out. "Pete," I called, "come look at this." He peered into the tiny bathroom and frowned. "That's strange. Miss Fenneman wasn't the type to leave a mess like that. She was real particular about keeping things tidy." I knelt down and picked up one of the pills. It was small and white with markings that looked like Wyeth and 57 on one side. I wrapped it in a tissue and pocketed it. Whatever. These pills were, somebody had wanted them gone badly enough to flush the rest down the toilet. The question was whether Margot had disposed of them herself or whether someone else had done it. I spent another few minutes going through the apartment more systematically. The closet contained mostly dance-related clothing, leotards, tights, wrap sweaters and a few street clothes. Everything was organized by color and type, hanging on identical hangers spaced exactly the same distance apart. It was almost obsessively neat. The kitchen yielded little of interest. Basic staples, some herbal tea, a few protein bars. The refrigerator contained yogurt, fruit, and vegetables. It was the diet of someone who treated her body as a professional instrument. But it was in the small desk by the window that I found something potentially significant. Buried under some bills and dance-related paperwork was a letter from a law firm in Chicago dated 6 weeks ago. The letter was brief but ominous. "Dear Miss Fenneman, this is to inform you that the restraining order against Vincent Kozlov expired on September 15th and has not been renewed. As we discussed, Mr. Kozlov has made no attempts to contact you or violate the terms of the order during its effective period. However, we wanted to make you aware that you no longer have legal protection against contact from him. If you wish to obtain a new restraining order, please contact our office immediately." The letter was signed by an attorney named Sarah Morrison at Morrison, Hayes and Associates. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket along with the pill. Vincent Kozlov, the name meant nothing to me, but clearly it meant something to Margot. Enough to make her leave Chicago, and enough to make her worried about expired legal protection. "Pete," I said as we prepared to leave the apartment, "have you noticed anyone unusual hanging around the building lately? Anyone who doesn't belong here?" He thought about it. "Well, there was a guy last week, maybe 10 days ago. Tall, thin fellow, well-dressed but something creepy about him. He was standing across the street just watching the building. When I came out to tell him to move along, he was gone. Might have been nothing, but it struck me as odd." "Can you describe him more specifically?" Like I said, tall and thin, dark hair, pale skin, expensive clothes, moved real quiet-like. And he had this way of standing perfectly still, like he was a statue or something. Most people fidget when they're waiting, but this guy just stood there without moving a muscle. I thanked Pete and left the building, but instead of heading directly to the theater, I decided to talk to Jerry Kowalski, the night doorman. His address in Queens meant a trip on the subway, but if he'd seen Margot leave the building Saturday night, it could be crucial information. Jerry Kowalski lived in a small apartment over a Korean grocery store in Flushing. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a kind of perpetually tired expression that comes from working night shifts for too many years. When I explained why I was there, he invited me in and offered me coffee that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. "Yeah, I remember Saturday night," he said, settling into an armchair that had seen better decades. "Quiet night mostly, but around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, I heard the elevator. Looked up and saw Miss Fenneman coming through the lobby. She looked terrible, scared, upset, like she'd been crying." "Was she alone?" "Yeah, but she kept looking back over her shoulder, like she thought someone was following her. She had a suitcase with her, one of those small rolling bags. When she got to the door, she stopped and looked back up at the elevator, like she was waiting for someone else to come down." "Did anyone else come down?" "Not right away. But maybe 5 minutes after she left, that red-haired guy came down. He looked around the lobby, then went outside. I watched through the window and saw him looking up and down the street, like he was trying to figure out which way she'd gone." "Did you see where Miss Fenneman went?" "She turned right out of the building toward Broadway. The red-haired guy went the same way, but he was moving faster, like he was trying to catch up with her. This was getting more interesting and more complicated. It sounded like David Kessler had been chasing Margot when she left her building, in the early morning hours. The question was whether he was pursuing her with romantic intentions or whether something more sinister was going on. "Jerry," I said, "this red-haired man, did he seem threatening to you, like he might hurt her?" Jerry considered this carefully. "Hard to say. He looked upset, maybe desperate, but not violent, if you know what I mean. More like he was trying to talk to someone who didn't want to listen." I thanked Jerry for his time and headed back to Manhattan. The afternoon was wearing on, and I still had a theater full of dancers to interview. But the picture that was emerging was becoming clearer and more troubling. Margot had been worried about someone from her past. She'd been acting nervous and distracted. And on the night she disappeared, she'd left her apartment at 3 in the morning with a suitcase while being pursued by a love-struck colleague. The Meridian Theatre was housed in a converted warehouse on West 46th Street, squeezed between a pawn shop and a Chinese restaurant that advertised authentic Sichuan cuisine in a window that hadn't been washed since the Carter administration. The building's facade was painted black with silver lettering that might have looked elegant if half the letters weren't missing or peeling. Our poster in the window advertised Shadows and Light opening tomorrow night, with a photograph of dancers silhouetted against dramatic lighting. Inside, the theatre was surprisingly impressive. Someone had spent real money converting the space, with a proper stage, good lighting equipment and seating for about 200 people. The walls were painted deep red and decorated with black and white photographs of dancers in various poses. The photographs were artistic and professional, showing the company members in costume and in rehearsal. Claire Vance met me in the lobby. She was a small, efficient-looking woman in her early 40s, with greying brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of permanent frown that comes from dealing with artists, budgets, and performance schedules simultaneously. She wore jeans and a black sweater, and her hands were stained with what looked like marker ink. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading me toward the theatre's office, which was tucked behind the box office. "We're all just devastated about Margot." The police didn't seem to take it seriously at all. They acted like she was just some flighty dancer who changed her mind about performing. "Tell me about Saturday night's rehearsal. I understand it was the final run-through before opening." Claire nodded, settling behind a desk that was buried under schedules, invoices, and what looked like several years' worth of theatre programs. The office was cramped and cluttered, with filing cabinets that had probably been there since the building was converted, and a coffee maker that was working overtime to keep up with demand. "It was supposed to be a full dress rehearsal," she said, "but we had some costume problems. Elena Rodriguez's costume split during the first act, and we had to do emergency repairs. So it ended up being more of a technical rehearsal. We were working on the lighting cues and scene changes mostly. How did Margot seem to you?" "Distracted during the first half, like Vera probably told you. She missed an entrance cue in the second scene, which never happens. Margot is usually letter perfect by final rehearsal, but after the break she was different, more intense. She danced the final sequence better than she'd ever done it before. It was almost like she was saying goodbye." The chill that ran down. My spine had nothing to do with the theatre's inadequate heating system. "Did you see her leave?" "No, I left right after we finished at 10:30. I had to get home to my kids. They were staying with a babysitter, and I don't like to leave them too late. But several people stayed behind. Marcus was working on some choreography notes, and I think a few of the dancers were still here too." "Can you tell me about the other company members? Any conflicts with Margot, romantic entanglements, professional jealousies?" Claire considered this carefully, and I could see her weighing how much to tell me. "Margot was professional in her relationships, but she wasn't particularly warm. She did her job, did it well, and went home. Some of the other dancers found her standoffish, maybe even a little cold, but she was never cruel or deliberately unkind." "What about specific conflicts?" "Well, Elena Rodriguez has been with the company longer than Margot, 3 years to Margot's 2. Elena expected to get the lead in Shadows and Light, and when Vera gave it to Margot instead, Elena was disappointed is probably too mild a word. She felt she deserved the role based on seniority and her loyalty to the company." "How did she express this disappointment?" "Oh, she was professional about it publicly, but I heard her talking to some of the other dancers, questioning whether Margot was really committed to the company, or whether she was just using us as a stepping stone to something bigger. There was some resentment there, definitely. What about the men? Any romantic interest? David Kessler had a thing for her, but Margot wasn't interested. She turned him down politely but firmly about 6 months ago. David took it well enough on the surface, but I could tell he was hurt. He kept trying to find excuses to spend time with her, to help her with choreography, or offer to drive her home after late rehearsals. Margot was patient with him, but you could see she was getting tired of having to keep saying no. Anyone else? She dated one of the musicians briefly last year, Stephen Chen, our violinist, but that ended amicably. Stephen said they were better as friends than as a couple. He's a nice guy, very talented, and he didn't seem bitter about the breakup. What about Boris Petrov? Vera mentioned some tension there. Claire sighed. Boris is complicated. He's an excellent dancer, very strong technically, but he has some old-school attitudes about hierarchy and respect. He's been with the company for 4 years, longer than anyone except Elena, and he feels like his experience should count for something. When Margot kept getting featured roles despite being relatively new, Boris started making comments about favoritism. What kind of comments? Nothing directly accusatory, but implications. He'd wonder aloud why certain people seem to get special treatment, or he'd make jokes about the casting process that weren't really jokes. Boris has a way of expressing his displeasure without saying anything you could call him on directly. I was making notes when voices from the theatre indicated that the dancers were arriving for rehearsal. Claire offered to introduce me to everyone, and we walked back into the main theatre space, where 5 dancers were warming up at a portable bar that had been set up stage left. The first thing that struck me was how different they all were physically. You might think all dancers would have a similar build, but these 5 ranged from Elena Rodriguez, who was petite and dark with the kind of precise, contained energy you see in fine clockwork, to Boris Petrov, a massive man who had to be at least 6'4" and looked like he could bench press a small car. David Kessler was easy to identify from Pete Garrison's description, tall, lean, with red hair that caught the stage lights. He was stretching at the bar with the focused intensity of someone trying not to think about something else. James Park was a slight Asian man who looked like he was still in his teens, and Natasha Williams was a willowy blonde who moved with the fluid grace of someone born to dance. "Everyone," Claire called out, "this is Archie Goodwin. He's a private investigator that Vera hired to look into Margot's disappearance." The reaction was immediate and mixed. Elena Rodriguez looked relieved, moving toward me with quick, decisive steps. "It's about time someone took this seriously. The police treated us like we were overreacting, like Margot was just some flighty performer who got cold feet." Boris Petrov nodded approvingly, his expression grave. "In Russia, when dancer disappears, is serious matter. Police do not make jokes." James Park seemed nervous, glancing around the theatre as if he expected Margot to materialize from the wings, and David Kessler looked actively hostile, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on me with undisguised suspicion. "About time is right," David said, but there was an edge to his voice that made everyone turn to look at him, though I have to wonder what kind of investigation this is going to be. Are you going to look for Margot, or are you going to assume she's dead like everyone else seems to? "I'm going to find out what happened to her," I said simply. "That's what her colleagues hired me to do." "Unless she wanted to disappear," David shot back. "Maybe Margot got tired of being stuck in a second-rate company doing second-rate work. Maybe she got a better offer somewhere else and decided to take it without bothering to give notice." The reaction to this was swift and negative. Elena stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "That's not like her, and you know it, David. Margot was committed to this company. She believed in what we were doing here." "Did she?" David moved closer to Elena, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Or was she just marking time until something better came along? Face it, Elena, none of us really knew Margot. She kept everyone at arm's length. For all we know, she could have been planning this for weeks." "That's enough," a new voice cut through the argument. The speaker was a man in his late 30s with dark hair, intense eyes, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from too much caffeine and too little sleep. This had to be Marcus Webb, the choreographer. "Marcus," Claire said, "this is Archie. Goodwin, the private investigator." Webb looked me up and down with the calculating stare of someone who was used to seeing people as elements in a larger composition. He was wearing black jeans and a grey sweater, and his hands were stained with what looked like chalk from marking the stage. "What do you need to know?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let's start with Saturday night." "I understand. You stayed late after the rehearsal ended." "I stayed to work on some problem spots in the second act. The lighting transitions weren't smooth, and there were some timing issues with the lifts in the final sequence. David and Elena stayed too, and I think Tommy was here for a while." I looked around for Tommy and realized I was missing someone from my list. "Where is Tommy Fitzgerald?" "He called in sick," Claire said. "Food poisoning, supposedly." "Convenient," David muttered under his breath. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elena demanded. wheeling on him with the quick fury of someone who'd had enough of his attitude. Nothing specific, just that Tommy's been acting strange lately. More than usual, I mean. He's always been a little eccentric, but lately he's been downright paranoid. Strange how? I asked. David shrugged, but I could see he was choosing his words carefully. Paranoid stuff. He kept saying someone was watching the company, following us around the city. Last week he was convinced someone had been in his dressing room going through his things even though nothing was missing. Did anyone else notice this surveillance he was worried about? The dancers exchanged glances, but nobody spoke up immediately. Finally, Eleanor said, "Tommy has a vivid imagination. He reads too many mystery novels and watches too many thriller movies. He's always seeing conspiracies where there aren't any." "But," James Park said quietly, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived, "he wasn't entirely wrong about someone watching us. I saw a man outside the theatre several times last week. Same man, just standing across the street, watching the building." This got everyone's attention. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Marcus asked. James shrugged, a slight movement that seemed to encompass his entire body. "I thought it was just someone waiting for a friend, or maybe a fan of the company. Some people do that, you know. They follow dance companies around, show up at all the performances. I didn't think it was important." "Can you describe this man?" I asked. "Tall, thin, well-dressed, dark hair, very pale skin. He had this way of standing perfectly still that was unsettling. Most people move around when they're waiting, shift their weight, check their watch. This guy just stood there like a statue." The description matched what Pete Garrison had told me about the man watching Margot's building. "Did you ever see him talking to anyone from the company?" "Not that I saw, but I wasn't paying that close attention. Tommy would have noticed more. He's very observant about things like that. I made a note to visit Tommy Fitzgerald as soon as possible. In my experience, paranoid people are often the first to notice things that other people miss. They may interpret normal events as threatening, but they also spot genuinely suspicious behavior that others overlook." "Marcus," I said, turning back, "that of the choreographer. Tell me about your relationship with Margot." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I saw Elena and David exchange a quick glance. "She was one of my principal dancers," Marcus said carefully. "What else is there to tell? People have suggested there might have been more to it than that." "People talk. It's what they do in theatre companies. Margot was talented, professional, and reliable. I gave her roles because she could handle them, not because of any personal relationship." "But there was a personal relationship." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching his dancers as they continued their warm-up exercises. The stage was set for shadows and light, and I could see that the choreography was complex and demanding, requiring precise timing and absolute trust between partners. Finally, he said, "Margot was a complicated person, driven, perfectionist, but also fragile in some ways. She had a past that she didn't like to talk about, experiences that had left her wary of getting too close to people." "What kind of past?" "I don't know the details. She mentioned once that she'd been in some kind of trouble in Chicago, something that made her leave the company there. But she never elaborated, and I didn't push. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." That confirmed what I'd learned from the letter in her apartment. "Did she seem worried about anything lately? Frightened?" "Not frightened exactly, but distracted. The last couple of weeks she seemed like she was waiting for something, or maybe dreading something. She kept checking her phone, looking over her shoulder. A few times I caught her staring off into space during rehearsals, which wasn't like her at all." "Did she ever mention anyone from her past? Anyone who might have followed her to New York?" Marcus hesitated, and I could see him debating how much to reveal. "About a month ago, she asked me if I knew anyone who did private security work. She said she might need someone to keep an eye on things for a while. When I asked her why, she said it was probably nothing, but she wanted to be prepared just in case. Did you give her any names? I gave her the number of a guy I know who does security consulting for theaters, but as far as I know, she never called him. Before I could ask more questions, Marcus excused himself to start rehearsal. I stayed to watch for a few minutes, curious to see how the company functioned without their lead dancer. Elena Rodriguez was dancing Margot's role, and while she was technically proficient and clearly gave everything she had to the performance, there was something missing. The passion, maybe, or the indefinable quality that separates good dancers from great ones. The piece itself was hauntingly beautiful, with a complex interplay of light and shadow that created an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The dancers moved in and out of pools of illumination, sometimes appearing to float in darkness, before emerging into brilliant spotlights. It was the kind of work that required not just technical skill, but emotional depth and complete commitment to the artistic vision. But as I watched, I noticed something odd. The stage was designed with specific areas of light and darkness, and the dancers moved through these areas in carefully choreographed patterns. However, there was one section, upstage left, that remained completely dark throughout the entire sequence, I observed. It struck me as strange from a design perspective. Why would you have dead space on stage during a performance? More intriguingly, I noticed that David Kessler kept glancing toward that dark area, and once I saw him actually miss a cue because he was distracted by something in the shadows. When I looked more carefully, I realized there was someone standing, back there almost invisible in the darkness. I moved to get a better angle and saw that it was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with pale skin and dark hair slicked back. He was wearing black clothes and standing perfectly still, just watching the rehearsal with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When he noticed me looking at him, he melted back into the shadows and disappeared. I tried to follow him, pushing through the wing space and backstage areas, but by the time I made it to the back of the theater, he was gone. There was a back exit that led to an alley, and I could hear footsteps echoing off the brick walls. But by the time I got outside, the alley was empty, except for a few garbage cans and a cat that looked at me with disdain before slinking away. When I went back inside, I pulled Claire aside. Who was that man watching from the shadow stage left? She looked puzzled, glancing back toward the stage where the dancers were still working through their routine. What man? I didn't see anyone back there. Tall, thin, dark hair. He was standing in the shadows during the rehearsal, watching everything. I have no idea who that could be. We don't allow anyone to watch rehearsals without permission, especially not this close to opening. Are you sure you saw someone? I was sure, but it was clear that Claire hadn't noticed him. The man had been skilled at staying invisible, blending into the shadows so completely that only someone specifically looking for watchers would have spotted him. But James Park had been right. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood perfectly still, observing everything with predatory patience. I made a mental note to ask the dancers about mysterious watchers, and decided it was time to pay a visit to Tommy Fitzgerald. If he was as paranoid and observant as everyone suggested, he might have noticed things that others had missed. I got Tommy's address from Claire, a fifth-floor walk-up in Hell's Kitchen, and took a cab across town. The building was one of those pre-war tenements that had probably been condemned, but somehow forgotten by the city bureaucracy, surviving on rent-controlled leases and the determination of tenants who had nowhere else to go. The hallway smelled of cooking oil, disinfectant, and something else I couldn't identify, but didn't want to think about too hard. The nameplate on apartment 5C read T. Fitzgerald in faded black lettering that looked like it had been there since the Truman administration. I climbed 5 flights of stairs that creaked ominously with each step, passing doors that were reinforced with multiple locks, and windows that had been painted shut. I knocked on Tommy's door and heard movement inside. Then a voice called out, "Who is it?" "Archie Goodwin. I'm a private investigator looking into Margot Fenneman's disappearance." There was a long pause, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just wide enough for me to see one eye and part of a pale face framed by sandy hair. "You're not police, private investigator." Vera Blackwood hired me to find Margot. The door opened wider, revealing a young man who looked like he hadn't eaten a decent meal or slept well in weeks. Tommy Fitzgerald was probably in his mid-20s, with a kind of hollow-cheeked intensity that could be either artistic temperament or malnutrition. He was wearing jeans and a sweater that had both seen better days, and his apartment behind him looked like the lair of someone who saw conspiracies everywhere. The apartment was small and cluttered with the debris of an obsessive personality. Newspapers and magazines stacked everywhere, a bulletin board covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and notes connected by colored string like something out of a detective movie, and books piled on every available surface. The windows were covered with heavy curtains despite the fact that it was broad daylight outside. "I knew something like this would happen," Tommy said, gesturing for me to sit on a couch that had seen better decades. "I tried to warn everyone, but they all thought I was being paranoid. Nobody listens to the crazy guy, you know." "Warn them about what?" "About him, the man who's been watching us, following us. I've seen him at least 6 times in the past month, outside the theatre, near my building, once at the coffee shop where Eleanor goes every morning before rehearsal." "Can you describe this man?" Tommy walked over to his bulletin board and pulled down a photograph that looked like it had been taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. The image was grainy, but clear enough to show a tall, thin man in dark clothes standing outside the theatre. It was the same man I'd seen in the shadows during rehearsal. Tall, thin, pale skin. Always wears dark clothes, black suits, black overcoats, like he's going to a funeral. He has this way of blending into shadows, so you almost don't notice him unless you're looking. But I've been looking. I've been watching for watchers. The paranoid's paradox. The very thing that made people dismiss Tommy as unstable also made him the perfect observer of genuinely suspicious behavior. "Did you ever see him talking to Margot?" Tommy nodded eagerly, pulling down more photographs. "Twice that I saw, probably more times that I didn't. The first time was about 2 weeks ago. I saw them talking outside the theatre after evening rehearsal. Margot looked upset, scared maybe. She kept shaking her head like she was saying no to whatever he was asking. Could you hear what they were talking about? I was too far away, but the body language was clear. He was asking for something and she was refusing. The second time was last Friday, the night before she disappeared. I saw him follow her into that coffee shop on Columbus Avenue near her apartment building. They sat at a corner table and talked for maybe 20 minutes. Could you get closer that time? A little. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught a few words. He kept saying something about coming home and being together. Margot looked terrified. She kept looking around like she was hoping someone would come help her. Did you tell anyone else about this? Tommy's expression darkened. I tried. I told David and Elena, but they thought I was imagining things. David said I read too many detective novels and watched too many thriller movies. Elena was more polite about it, but I could tell she didn't believe me either. He gestured toward the bookshelf, which was indeed lined with mysteries and thrillers. But this isn't fiction. This is real, and now Margot's gone. Maybe if they'd listened to me, we could have done something to help her. Any idea who this man might be? Did you ever see him anywhere else in any other context? Tommy shook his head, then paused. Well, there was one thing. Last week I followed him when he left the theatre. I know it was risky, but I wanted to find out more about him. He walked to that parking garage on 47th Street and got into a car. What kind of car? Black sedan, looked like a rental. Had one of those barcodes on the rear window, you know? The kind Budget and Hertz use for their fleet vehicles. Did you see the license plate? I got part of it. Tommy pulled out a notebook and flipped through several pages of cramped handwriting. It started with LBK, but I couldn't see the numbers before he drove away. I thanked Tommy for his time and gave him my card. If you see this man again, don't try to follow him. Just call me immediately, day or night. You believe me, don't you? About someone watching us? I believe you, I said, and meant it. Tommy might be paranoid, but in this case his paranoia seemed justified. Someone had indeed been watching the dance company, and that someone was connected to Margot's disappearance. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was nearly 6 o'clock, and Wolfe was in the office with his afternoon beer, reading a book about the decline of the Byzantine Empire. He looked up when I entered and raised his eyebrows interrogatively. Margot Fenneman didn't just disappear, I said, settling into my chair. Someone was stalking her, a tall, thin man with dark hair who's been following members of the company for at least a month. I saw him myself at the theatre today. I filled him in on everything I'd learned, the pills in Margot's bathroom, the mysterious watcher at the theatre, Tommy's observations and photographs, the revelation about expired legal protection from someone named Vincent Kozlov, and David Kessler's late-night pursuit of Margot when she left her apartment with a suitcase. Wolfe listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or grunting to indicate he was following my narrative. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers in front of his face. The pills. Did you have them analyzed? I pulled out the tissue containing the pill I'd found in Margot's bathroom. Not yet. I thought you might have a suggestion for a discreet laboratory. Dr. Vollmer will identify them. Call him now. Dr. Vollmer was our physician and occasional consultant on medical matters related to our cases. He'd helped us before when we needed professional analysis of drugs or other substances. What about the mysterious stalker? He's the key to everything, Wolfe said with certainty. A man doesn't follow dancers around Manhattan for weeks without purpose. Either he's connected to Miss Fenneman's past troubles in Chicago, or he represents a current threat. Given that she's now missing, I suspect both. So Vincent Kozlov followed her from Chicago. Almost certainly. The expired restraining order, the increased surveillance in recent weeks, her nervous behavior. It all fits. Mr. Kozlov has been building up to something, and Saturday night was when he made his move. I called Dr. Vollmer and explained what I needed. He agreed to identify the pill if I brought it to his office, but warned me it might take a day or two if it required sophisticated testing. Then I tried to reach Sarah Morrison, the attorney who'd written the letter about the expired restraining order, but her office was closed for the day. Tomorrow morning, Wolfe said, contact the Chicago attorney and learn everything you can about Vincent Kozlov. Also, check his credit card records if possible. Look for property rentals, vacation homes, isolated locations within driving distance of New York. What makes you think he's still in the area? If Mr. Kozlov simply wanted to kill Miss Fenneman, he could have done so in Chicago 2 years ago. The fact that he followed her here suggests he wants something more complex. Compliance, submission, acknowledgement of his devotion. That requires time and privacy. He's taken her somewhere he can control the situation completely. The thought sent a chill down my spine. So she could still be alive? Possibly. But her situation is precarious. Men like Kozlov live in fantasy. Worlds where their victims eventually come to appreciate their devotion. When reality intrudes, when the victim continues to resist or reject them, they can become violent very quickly. I spent the evening making phone calls to rental car agencies and hotels, trying to trace Vincent Kozlov's movements since his arrival in New York. It was tedious work, and most companies were reluctant to give out customer information without a court order. But persistence paid off. On my fourth call to Enterprise Rent-A-Car, I hit pay dirt. Vincent Keller, the night manager told me after I'd convinced him it was a police matter and given him a badge number that may or may not have existed. Rented a black Nissan Altima on September 15th for a month-long rental, paid with a credit card, and provided a California driver's license. Do you have an address where he's staying? The Plaza Hotel on Fifth Avenue. The Plaza, our stalker, had expensive tastes, which suggested he had significant financial resources. I immediately called the hotel, but when I asked to be connected to Vincent Keller's room, I was told no one by that name was currently registered. He may have checked out recently, I said. Could you check your records? After a few minutes, on hold, I learned that Vincent Keller had indeed been a guest at the Plaza from September 15th through October 8th, the day after Margot disappeared. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Did he leave a forwarding address? I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out that information over the phone. I was about to try a different approach when Fritz announced that dinner was ready. Wolfe never discusses business during meals. He considers it bad for digestion and worse for the appreciation of good food. So I spent the next hour thinking about the case while working my way through the evening's fare. Roast duck with cherry. Sauce wild rice with almonds and asparagus that had been prepared exactly the way Wolfe demanded. After dinner, we returned to the office to find Saul Panzer waiting for us. Saul is a small, neat man who looks like a bookkeeper, but has the investigative instincts of a bloodhound. He was sitting in the red leather chair with a manila folder in his lap and the satisfied expression of someone who had been productive. Vincent Keller, also known as Victor Kozlov, also known as Victor Kenyon, Saul said without preamble, opening his folder. Real name is probably Vincent Kozlowski, though I can't be certain about that either. He's been using false identities for at least 5 years, moving from city to city every few months. Criminal record? Wolfe asked. Nothing violent on paper, but several restraining orders in different cities. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, always the same pattern. He becomes fixated on a woman, usually a performer of some kind, and stalks her until she gets legal protection or moves away to escape him. Then he follows, I asked. Sometimes. In 2 cases I could verify he tracked his targets to new cities and resumed stalking them there. One woman, a violinist in Cleveland, ended up changing her name and moving to Europe to get away from him. Another woman, a ballet dancer in Detroit, had to get her family involved. Her brothers paid him a visit that convinced him to leave her alone. What's his background? How does he afford to live this lifestyle? Comes from money, apparently. His family made their fortune in construction back in Poland before World War II, then emigrated to the States in the 1950s. Vincent inherited a substantial trust fund when his parents died, enough to live comfortably without working. No permanent address, no close relationships, no hobbies or interests except his obsessions with various women. Where is he now? Saul's expression grew more serious. That's the interesting part. After he checked out of the Plaza 3 days ago, he disappeared completely. Returned the rental car to LaGuardia Airport Tuesday morning, but there's no record of him taking a flight anywhere. No hotel registrations under any of his known aliases, no new rental car agreements, no credit card transactions since Monday. I felt a chill. It's like he's gone to ground. Or like he's finished his business in New York and is covering his tracks, Saul said grimly. But there's one more thing. I found a credit card transaction from last Thursday at a hardware store in Newburgh, New York. He bought rope, duct tape, and what the clerk described as soundproofing materials. Newburgh was about 60 miles north of the city, in the Hudson Valley, remote enough to provide privacy, close enough for easy transportation. The purchases suggested preparation for long-term captivity. Any property connections in that area? I asked. Still working on that. Property records take time to search, especially when you're dealing with someone who uses multiple identities. But I should have more information by tomorrow. Wolfe leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. This was his thinking position, and I'd learned not to interrupt him when he assumed it. After several minutes, he opened his eyes and looked at me. "Tomorrow morning, visit the garage where Mr. Kozlov returned. His rental car. Airlines keep passenger manifests, but there are other ways to leave the city. Trains, buses, private cars. If he transported Miss Fenneman somewhere against her will, he would need a vehicle. You think she's still alive? I think Mr. Kozlov has invested too much time and effort in his obsession to simply kill Miss Fenneman outright. He wants something. From her. Compliance, submission, acknowledgement of his devotion. Murder would end the relationship he's trying to create. But if she continues to resist him, then her situation becomes increasingly dangerous. Men like Kozlov often convince themselves that their victim's resistance is temporary, that given enough time and the right circumstances, they will eventually reciprocate their feelings. But when reality intrudes, when it becomes clear that the victim will never willingly participate in the fantasy, they can become violent. Saul left to continue his research into property records and vehicle rentals. I spent the evening making phone calls to Amtrak Greyhound and several car rental agencies at other airports, but came up empty. Kozlov seemed to have vanished without a trace, taking Margot with him. The next morning I drove out to LaGuardia Airport to talk to the Enterprise office where Kozlov had returned his rental car. The manager, a harried-looking woman named Janet, Reeves remembered him clearly despite the busy Tuesday morning rush. "Strange guy," she said, leading me to a small office behind the rental counter. "Very polite, very clean, but something creepy about him. He had this way of standing too close when he talked to you, and his eyes never seemed to blink. Did he say anything about where he was going? Just that he was finished with his business in New York and wouldn't be needing the car anymore. Oh, and he asked about long-term storage for some luggage. We don't offer that service, but I referred him to a company that does airport storage and shipping. Can you give me the name of that company?" "Storewright Airport Services. They're in Building C, about a quarter mile from here. 20 minutes. Later I was talking to Phil Martinez, the manager of Storewright Airport Services, a company that specialized in luggage storage and shipping for international travelers. Yes, he remembered Vincent Keller very well. Paid for 6 months in advance cash, Martinez told me. Said he was going traveling and didn't want to carry all his luggage with him. Rented one of our large lockers, number 47. Is the locker still active? Far as I know, want to take a look at it? The storage facility was a series of warehouse buildings near the airport perimeter. Locker 47 was about the size of a small closet, secured with both a company lock and a customer-provided padlock. When Martinez opened the company lock, I could see that the locker contained 3 expensive suitcases, a garment bag, and several cardboard boxes. "I need to look inside these," I told Martinez. "I can't let you do that without a warrant or the customer's permission. Company policy." I was about to argue when my phone rang. It was Saul with news that made my heart race. "I found something," he said. "Kozlov has another credit card transaction from yesterday morning at a grocery store in Newburgh. He's still there, Archie, and he's buying food for more than one person. Newburgh was close enough for me to drive there in less than 2 hours, but first I needed more specific information about where Kozlov might be hiding. Did you find any property connections?" "Still working on that, but I found something else. There's a Vincent Kelly, note the similar name, who rented a cabin from a property management company called Hudson Valley Retreats about 3 weeks ago. The rental was for 2 months, paid in advance with cash. Do you have an address?" "Ridge Road, about 5 miles north of Newburgh. Isolated place, according to the rental agent. No close neighbors, surrounded by woods. I left the storage facility and drove straight back to Manhattan to brief Wolfe. When I told him about the grocery purchases and the cabin rental, his expression grew grim. "Miss Fenneman is alive, but in immediate danger," he said. "Mr. Kozlov's grocery purchases suggest he's prepared for an extended captivity situation. The isolated location means he's not concerned about her making noise. Should I call the police?" Not yet. We need more specific information about his location, and we need to be certain Miss Fenneman is actually there. A false alarm could spook him into doing something desperate. So what do you suggest? Contact the local sheriff's department, but discreetly. Ask about any reports of suspicious activity in remote areas near Newburgh. If there have been any complaints about noise or unusual behavior, we'll know we're on the right track. I spent the next hour on the phone with various law enforcement agencies in the Newburgh area. Most were helpful, but had nothing useful to report. It was only when I reached the Orange County Sheriff's Department that I learned something significant. Funny. You should call, Deputy Sheriff Mike Rodriguez told me. We've had a couple of reports in the past few days about strange noises coming from the old Brennan property up on Ridge Road. Place has been empty for 2 years since Mrs. Brennan died, but somebody's definitely been using it. What kind of noises? Crying, screaming. Could be an animal, but Mrs. Patterson, who lives about a quarter-mile away, swears it sounds human. She's been calling us every day, but every time we send a car by, everything looks quiet. What's the exact address? It's not really an address. It's about 5 miles north of town on Ridge Road, just past the old lumber mill. Old farmhouse set back in the woods. Can't see it from the road unless you know where to look. Has anyone actually been up to the house? We knocked on the door twice, but nobody answered. There's a car parked there. Black sedan with New York plates, but we can't see any signs of activity. The curtains are all drawn and the place looks deserted during the day. My pulse quickened. Deputy Rodriguez, I have reason to believe that someone may be holding a woman against her will in that house. Her name is Margot Fenneman, and she's been missing from New York for 4 days. There was a pause. Are you saying this is a kidnapping situation? That's exactly what I'm saying. The man who took her is named Vincent Kozlov, and he has a history of stalking women. I think he's been holding Miss Fenneman in that house since Sunday night. Jesus. Why didn't you call us sooner? We needed to be sure of the location before involving local law enforcement. If you spook him, he might hurt her or run with her to another location. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then said, I'll get some backup and meet you there, can't I? You be in Newburgh in 2 hours. I'll be there in 90 minutes. I immediately called Saul and asked him to meet me in Newburgh, then informed Wolfe of the development. Under no circumstances are you to approach that property alone, he said firmly. If Miss Fenneman is being held there, Mr. Kozlov will be desperate. Desperate people are unpredictable and dangerous. I promised to wait for backup and left for Newburgh, driving north through the autumn landscape of the Hudson Valley. The leaves were at their peak, painting the hillsides in brilliant reds and golds, but I was too focused on what lay ahead to appreciate the scenery. Somewhere ahead of me, if I was right, Margot Fenneman was being held prisoner by a man whose obsession had driven him to kidnapping. I met Saul and Deputy Rodriguez at a diner in Newburgh. Rodriguez was a compact man in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his career dealing with domestic disputes and minor crimes. A kidnapping was definitely outside his usual experience. Tell me about this Kozlov, he said as we drove toward Ridge Road in his patrol car. I filled him in on everything we knew, the stalking pattern, the false identities, the substantial financial resources that allowed him to move from city to city, pursuing his obsessions. He's not violent in the traditional sense, I said, but he's completely disconnected from reality. In his mind, he's not kidnapping women. He's rescuing them from lives he considers unworthy. That might make him more dangerous, not less, Rodriguez said grimly. If he thinks he's the good guy in this scenario, he might do anything to protect what he sees as a romantic relationship. The Ridge Road turnoff was marked by a rusted mailbox and a dirt driveway that disappeared into thick woods. We parked about a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving carefully through the trees. The house was exactly as Rodriguez had described, an old farmhouse set back from the road and nearly hidden by overgrown trees and brush. There was indeed a black sedan parked in the driveway, and tire tracks in the dirt suggested recent activity. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and I couldn't see any movement inside. But as we got closer, I could hear something, a faint sound that might have been crying or moaning. Saul motioned for me to stay back while he moved closer to one of the windows. After a moment he returned and whispered, "There's someone tied to a chair in what looks like the living room. Can't tell if it's her, but whoever it is appears to be alive." Rodriguez radioed for additional backup, then positioned himself at the back of the house while Saul and I approached the front. The door was solid wood, recently reinforced with additional locks. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see into a hallway that led to several rooms. "Police!" Rodriguez called out, though he was actually Sheriff's Department. "We'd like to talk to you." The response was immediate and chilling, a man's voice, calm, but with an unmistakable edge of hysteria. "Go away. This is private property, and you have no right to be here. Margot and I just want to be left alone." So it was definitely Margot, and she was alive. The relief I felt was immediately replaced by concern for her safety. From what I could see through the gap in the curtains, Kozlov was somewhere in the house, but not visible from our position. "Sir," Rodriguez continued, "we've had reports of someone in distress. We just need to make sure everyone's all right." "Everyone is fine. Margot and I are fine. She's resting right now, but she's perfectly safe. We don't need any help from anyone." "Sir, we need to see that Miss Fenneman is unharmed. If you could just bring her to the door so we can see she's—" "Okay, we'll leave you alone." There was a long pause, then, "She can't come to the door right now. She's sleeping and I don't want to disturb her. She's been through a lot lately and she needs her rest." "Then could you tell us your name, sir?" Another pause, longer this time. "My name is Vincent Kozlov, and Margot is my fiancée. We're engaged to be married, and we just want some privacy to plan our future together." Even through the door I could hear the complete delusion in his voice. This was a man who had kidnapped a woman and convinced himself it was a romantic relationship. He actually believed that holding Margot prisoner was somehow equivalent to being engaged to her. Saul caught my eye and pointed toward a window on the side of the house. He was suggesting we try to get a better view of the interior layout before making any move. I nodded, and we began to circle the house while Rodriguez kept Kozlov talking. From the side window, I could see into what appeared to be the living room. Margot was indeed tied to a wooden chair in the center of the room, and the sight made my blood run cold. She was conscious, but appeared weak, her head lolling to one side as if she were having trouble staying alert. Her clothes were dirty and disheveled, and even from a distance I could see that she'd lost weight. Kozlov was pacing back and forth in front of her, gesturing as if he were having an animated conversation. Though I couldn't hear his words from outside, he was exactly as Tommy had described. Tall, thin, pale, with dark hair that was now disheveled from whatever stress he was experiencing. But what struck me most was his agitation. His movements were becoming increasingly erratic, and he kept running his hands through his hair in a gesture that spoke of mounting desperation. I was watching this scene when I saw Margot lift her head and look directly at Kozlov. Her lips were moving, and whatever she was saying seemed to upset him greatly. He stopped pacing and leaned down close to her face, his own expression growing angry and threatening. That's when I realized we needed to act immediately. The situation was escalating, and Margot was in immediate danger. I signaled to Saul, and we moved back to where Rodriguez was still trying to negotiate with Kozlov through the door. "He's getting agitated," I whispered. "We need to go in now." Rodriguez nodded grimly and spoke into his radio, calling for additional backup that was already on the way. But even as he did, we all heard Margot scream from inside the house, a sound of pure terror that cut through the afternoon air like a knife. "That's it," Rodriguez said, and kicked the door open. What followed happened very quickly, but it seemed to unfold in slow motion. We rushed into the house and found Kozlov standing over Margot with what appeared to be a knife in his hand. When he saw us, his face contorted with rage and something that might have been genuine heartbreak. "You're ruining everything," he screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. She was finally starting to understand. She was starting to see how much I love her, how much better her life could be with me. "Put the knife down, Vincent," Rodriguez said, his gun drawn but not yet aimed. "Nobody needs to get hurt here. She belongs to me. I saved her from that pathetic life, from those second-rate dancers and that crumbling theater. I gave her a real life, a life with someone who truly appreciates her talent, her beauty, her perfect soul." Margot was conscious but barely responsive. Her eyes were unfocused, and she was having trouble holding her head up. So I could see now what the pills in her apartment had been for. He'd been drugging her to keep her compliant and manageable. "Vincent," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, "Margot needs medical attention. Look at her, she's sick. She needs to go to a hospital. She's fine." But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Margot was clearly not fine, and even his delusional mind couldn't completely ignore that fact. She just needs time to adjust. This is all new for her, being loved properly for the first time in her life. "If you really care about her," Saul said quietly, "you'll let us get her help." That seemed to get through to him, at least partially. Kozlov looked down at Margot, then at the knife in his hand, then at the three of us. For a moment I thought he might surrender, that some remnant of sanity might assert itself. Instead, he raised the knife to his own throat. "If I can't have her, then this whole thing has been for nothing," he said, and now there were tears streaming down his face. "Everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed, all the cities I've traveled to, all the time I've spent trying to find someone who could understand real love, it's all meaningless without her." "Vincent, don't do this," Rodriguez said urgently. "Put the knife down and we can work this out. We can get you help, get both of you help." But I could see in Kozlov's eyes that there would be no working anything out. He was completely disconnected from reality, lost in a fantasy world where kidnapping was love and imprisonment was rescue. The intrusion of reality, our presence, Margot's obvious distress, the impossibility of his situation, was shattering the elaborate delusion he'd constructed. What happened next surprised all of us. Margot, despite her drugged state and obvious weakness, somehow found the strength to speak. "Vincent," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for all of us to hear, "please don't hurt yourself. I don't want you to die." It wasn't true, of course. It was the desperate gambit of someone who understood that her captor's suicide might be her own death sentence. But the words had an immediate effect on Kozlov. He lowered the knife slightly and stared at her with desperate, pathetic hope. "You do care about me," he said, his voice breaking. "I knew you did. I knew if I just gave you enough time, if I just showed you how much better life could be, you'd realize what we could have together." "I do care," Margot whispered, and I could see the tremendous effort it was costing her to maintain this fiction. "But I'm sick, Vincent. I need help. Please let these men help me." Rodriguez seized on this opening. "She's right, Vincent. She needs medical attention, and so do you. You've been under a lot of stress, carrying all this responsibility for both of you. Let us take some of that burden off your shoulders." The negotiation continued for another 10 minutes, with Margot somehow finding the strength to maintain the pretense that she had feelings for her captor. It was an extraordinary performance, requiring her to suppress every natural instinct for revenge and self-preservation in favor of manipulation and psychological survival. Finally, Kozlov sat down the knife and allowed Rodriguez to approach Margot. His surrender wasn't complete. He continued to hover nearby, ready to intervene if he thought we were taking her away from him rather than helping her. But it was enough for us to begin untying her bonds and assessing her condition. The ambulance. arrived 20 minutes later, along with additional sheriff's deputies and, eventually, FBI agents who would handle the federal kidnapping charges. Margot was conscious but severely dehydrated and suffering from the effects of 4 days of forced sedation with what turned out to be lorazepam. The doctors at the regional hospital said she would recover completely, though it might take weeks to fully clear the drugs from her system. Kozlov was arrested and charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, interstate stalking, and possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute. During his initial interrogation, he revealed the full extent of his obsession with Margot, including detailed plans for their new life together that he'd been developing for months. He'd first seen her perform with the Chicago Ballet Theatre almost 3 years ago and had immediately become fixated on her. The stalking had escalated gradually, first just attending every performance, then following her to and from the theatre, then showing up at places where she shopped or ate. When she'd gotten the restraining order, he'd been forced to maintain his distance, but he'd never stopped watching and planning. When the restraining order expired in September, he'd seen it as a sign that they were meant to be together. He'd tracked her to New York, rented an apartment at the plaza under a false identity, and begun the careful surveillance that Tommy Fitzgerald had observed. The break-in at the theatre had been his attempt to find and destroy the evidence Margot had been gathering against him, photographs, documentation, anything that could have led to his arrest. The cabin in Newburgh had been rented weeks in advance, as part of an elaborate plan to take Margot away from what he saw as her unworthy life in New York. In his mind, he was rescuing her from a second-rate dance company and giving her the devotion and appreciation she deserved. The soundproofing materials and restraints had been purchased not as instruments of torture, but as temporary measures to help her adjust to their new life together. He really believed she would eventually fall in love with him, Deputy Rodriguez told me later as we were finishing the paperwork. In his mind, he wasn't kidnapping her. He was courting her in the most romantic way possible. He saw himself as a devoted suitor who was willing to sacrifice everything for love. Did he say anything about his other victims? Same pattern with all of them. He convinced himself that each woman was the one, that their relationship was destined to be perfect if he could just make them understand how much he loved them. When they rejected him or got restraining orders, he saw it as a temporary setback, not a permanent rejection. What happens to him now? Federal kidnapping charges carry serious time, especially with his history of stalking. His lawyer will probably try for an insanity defense, but the premeditation and planning make that difficult to prove. My guess is he'll spend the next 20 to 30 years in prison, assuming he doesn't hurt himself first. I returned to New York that evening, feeling both relieved and disturbed by what I'd witnessed. The case was closed in the legal sense. Margot was safe, Kozlov was in custody, and justice would be served through the court system. But the psychological dimensions of the case continued to trouble me. Vincent Kozlov genuinely believed he loved Margot Fenneman, but his version of love required her complete surrender of autonomy, her acceptance of imprisonment, her gratitude for being rescued from her own choices. He couldn't see that real love requires freedom, the freedom to choose, to leave, to say no. In his twisted mind, Margot's terror was temporary confusion that would eventually give way to appreciation. Her attempts to escape were misguided impulses. That needed to be controlled for her own good. Her rejection of his advances was simply evidence that she didn't yet understand what was best for her. It made me think about all the ways people deceive themselves about their relationships, all. The small compromises and larger surrenders that can transform love into something uglier and more controlling. How many people in the world are living in cages they don't even recognize, held prisoner by someone who claims to have their best interests at heart? The next morning, I found Wolfe in the office with his usual breakfast beer and a book about orchid cultivation. He looked up when I entered and raised his eyebrows interrogatively. "Case closed," I said simply. "Margot Fenneman is safe. Vincent Kozlov is in federal custody. The Meridian Theatre Company can proceed with their opening." "Night. Satisfactory," Wolfe said, and returned to his book as if nothing unusual had happened. But I noticed that he'd already moved on from the Byzantine history and was reading something about the care and feeding of traumatized plants, a subject that seemed oddly appropriate given what Margot had endured. 3 days later, Vera Blackwood called to tell me that the opening night performance of Shadows and Light had gone beautifully. Elena Rodriguez had danced Margot's role with a passion and commitment that surprised everyone, and the reviews had been enthusiastic. The critics said Elena brought a new depth to the role, Vera told me. Something about the way she moved through the shadows. Like she was dancing not just the choreography but the emotions behind it. It was extraordinary. What about Margot? How is she doing? Better than anyone expected. She's still in the hospital, but the doctors say she should be able to come home in a few days. She's already talking about returning to the company for our next production. She says dancing is the best therapy for what she's been through. And the other company members? Everyone's relieved, of course. David feels terrible about doubting her commitment to the company. Tommy Fitzgerald has been vindicated. Everyone realizes now that his paranoia was actually careful observation. Even Elena admits she was wrong to resent Margot's success. What about the future? Are you concerned about security? We've hired a professional security consultant, and we're being much more careful about who has access to rehearsals and performances. But honestly, I think the worst is behind us. Kozlov is locked up, and Margot is stronger than any of us realized. That sounded like the Margot Fenneman who had emerged from this ordeal, a woman with the courage to save not only her own life, but the life of her captor, even though he'd given her every reason to want him dead. She'd found a way to turn her terror into a tool of survival, using her captor's delusions against him to create the opening that saved them both. A week later, I received an unexpected phone call from Margot herself. She was still recovering, but her voice was steady and clear. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I wanted to thank you for finding me. The doctors say that if you'd waited another day or two, the combination of drugs and dehydration might have been fatal. I'm glad we found you in time. How are you feeling? Physically, I'm getting stronger every day. Psychologically, well, that's more complicated. I keep thinking about Vincent, about how convinced he was that he was acting out of love. It's disturbing to realize that someone can care about you so much and yet understand you so little. Have you been able to make sense of what happened?" There was a long pause. "I think Vincent saw me as a symbol rather than a person. He fell in love with the idea of me, the dancer on stage, the artist pursuing her dreams. But he never bothered to learn who I actually was. When reality didn't match his fantasy, he decided reality was wrong. That must make it difficult to trust people. In some ways, yes. But it's also made me more aware of the difference between people who see me as I am and people who see me as they want me to be. The people at Meridian, Vera, Marcus, even David and Elena, they may not always like my choices, but they respect my right to make them. That's worth more than I realized. Are you really planning to return to dancing?" "Absolutely. Vincent tried to steal my life from me, but he failed. The best revenge I can imagine is to keep dancing, to keep making the choices he tried to take away from me. Besides," and here I could hear a smile in her voice, "I have a career to rebuild and a company that's counting on me." 2 weeks after that, I attended the final performance of Shadows and Light at the Meridian Theatre. Margot had indeed returned to the company and was dancing her original role. The performance was extraordinary. Not just technically perfect, but emotionally powerful in a way that transcended mere entertainment. During the final sequence, as Margot moved through the interplay of light and shadow that gave the piece its name. I found myself thinking about the difference between being seen and being truly known. Vincent Kozlov had watched Margot perform dozens of times, had studied her movements and memorized her schedule, had devoted months of his life to observing her. But he had never really seen her, only his own projection of what he wanted her to be. The people who truly knew Margot, her colleagues, her friends, even those who had initially doubted her commitment, had recognized that she would never abandon her responsibilities without explanation. They had trusted their knowledge of her character, even when the evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. As I sat in the theater watching Margot dance, I realized that the case had raised questions that went far beyond finding a missing person. What does it mean to love someone? How do we distinguish between genuine affection and destructive obsession? When does caring become controlling, and when does devotion become imprisonment? These are questions that linger long after the case files are closed and the checks are deposited. In the end, perhaps that's what makes us human, not the certainty of our answers, but the persistence of our questions. Vincent Kozlov believed he loved Margot Fenneman with a devotion that justified any action, any violation of her autonomy, any denial of her choices. But love that requires the destruction of the beloved's freedom isn't love at all. It's possession disguised as romance, control masqueraded as care. Real love, I realized, watching Margot dance, requires the courage to let the other person be, themselves, to make their own choices, even when we disagree with them, to risk rejection in favor of genuine connection. It means seeing people as they are rather than as we want them to be. Margot had survived her ordeal not just through physical courage, but through psychological strength that allowed her to maintain her sense of self even under extreme duress. She had refused to become the person Kozlov wanted her to be, even when compliance might have made her situation easier, and in the end she had found a way to use his delusions against him, turning his need for her approval into the tool of her own liberation. After the performance, I went backstage to congratulate the company on their success. Margot looked tired but radiant, surrounded by flowers and well-wishers. When she saw me, she broke away from the crowd and came over. "Thank you again," she said simply. "For everything." "You saved yourself," I told her. "I just helped find you." Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without knowing that people were looking for me, that I hadn't been forgotten or written off. That made all the difference. As I walked home through the October evening, I found myself thinking about justice and mercy, about the difference between punishment and healing, about the courage it takes to choose compassion over revenge. Vincent Kozlov would spend decades in prison, but his real punishment was the knowledge that his grand gesture of devotion had caused nothing but pain to the woman he claimed to love. But what about the rest of us? How do we learn to love without possessing, to care without controlling, to desire without demanding? How do we recognize the difference between genuine affection and the kind of destructive obsession that masquerades as love? And what about forgiveness? Margot had found the strength to speak gently to her captor, even in his final moments of freedom, to show him mercy even when he had shown her none. Could she ever truly forgive him for what he had stolen from her? Or was survival enough? These are the questions that continue to haunt me months after the case was closed. They're questions without easy answers, but perhaps that's the point. The human heart is complicated territory, full of contradictions and shadows that resist simple explanations. What do you think? Is it possible to love someone so much that you lose sight of their humanity? Can obsession ever be transformed into something healthier? Or does it always contain the seeds of its own destruction? And when someone claims to love you, how do you distinguish between genuine affection and the kind of possessive desire that would cage you in the name of care? I'd be curious to know what city you're watching from as you consider these questions. Every place has its own stories of love gone wrong, its own cautionary tales about the dangers of confusing possession with passion. In New York, these dramas play out in theaters and apartments and coffee shops, in the spaces between strangers who become obsessed and lovers who become prisoners. The stage lights may be off, but the human drama continues, playing out in theaters and apartments and coffee shops all around the world. Sometimes the only difference between a love story and a horror story is whether both people get to choose their roles. In Margot's case, she eventually did get to choose. She chose to dance, to return to the stage, to reclaim the life that someone else had tried to steal from her. She chose to transform her trauma into art, her survival into strength. That choice, more than any court verdict or prison sentence, was the real victory in this case. The dancer stepped back into the light, and that perhaps is the most hopeful ending any of us can ask for. In a world where people sometimes mistake obsession for devotion and control for love, the simple act of choosing your own path becomes an act of rebellion, a declaration of independence from those who would define you by their desires rather than your own. Margot Fenneman danced her way back to freedom, one step at a time, one choice at a time. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that the most powerful response to those who would diminish us is simply to refuse to be diminished, to keep dancing even when, especially when, someone tries to steal our music.